Wow.
Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome. Great to have you here as we continue with our series on biomimicry and resurrection. And we are very fortunate today, excuse me, to have Don Weinkoff speaking to us about the engineering aspect of all of this. We know Don, of course, from years and years, but let me say a few words about him before he gets underway. He is the Dean of Engineering at the University of St. Thomas.
Wow.
And prior to this position, Don was professor of chemical engineering at New Mexico Tech in Socorro, New Mexico. He has been honored nationally for his teaching and research, Dreyfus Teacher Scholar, and prior to his career in academia, Don worked for Shell Oil Company as a research engineer in the development of new plastics materials. He's the author of multiple U.S. patents and has been the lead on over $8 million of research grants in the areas of advanced materials and renewable energy technology. And as he will share, advances in the fields of physics and material science have been fundamentally driven by a deep observation of the natural world. So please join me in welcoming Don.
All right. Thank you.
Very impressive, Don.
Yeah, thank you. You know, I really love the prayer that Lynn and Kathy shared. This really, in fact, I think we're even going to see sort of a replay of this prayer in some of James Joule's comments about the first law of thermodynamics. But if someone would like to read this, or would you be willing to?
Sure. Almighty and everlasting God, you made the universe with all its marvelous order, its atoms, worlds, and galaxies, and the infinite complexity of living creatures. Grant that as we probe the mysteries of your creation, we may come to know you more truly and more surely fulfill our role in your eternal purpose. In the name of Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen.
Thank you, Phil. I love this prayer because I think if you were to put this in front of a scientist or an engineer and sort of abstract out the your and grant and God, they would say this is exactly the definition of science, that this seeking out the marvelous order of the universe is really what science is. And whether it's science or faith, I think both are led by a very similar mantra. Let's see if this is going to advance. Let's see. Next slide. There we go. I would also add to an adage that scientists and engineers live with, that we're always trailing behind. In fact, the adage is, as scientists and engineers ascend to the summit of a new level of understanding about the universe, they arrive to only find that the philosophers and the theologians have been there for a long time. And there's nothing more true than that than we're going to hear in one of my stories. So I'm going to tell you 3 stories, hopefully quickly today. I haven't run through. These are parts of lectures that I would give in my thermodynamics class, or I give many lectures to high school students about energy and our energy future. And so this is really parts of that. So there's 2 stories about observation in the natural world. There's a story about maybe resurrection, because we've been asked about resurrection here. And then I'm going to just call it a story. Another subtitle of this is a lot of white men with beards. So let's start with, my children always accuse me of that, Dad, all of your stories start in a bar, and so I don't want to differentiate from that today. So we're going to start at the J.P. Joule pub in Sale, England. It's named after the white man with the beard, James P. Joule. I'm not sure if you know him, but actually he was a brewer. His family was brewers, and he became fascinated with all of the equipment and materials, and more particularly thermometers that he was going to be using to accurately run his brewing. Just absolutely by the way, a very faithful person and a keen observer of the natural world. And we all know him as the father of thermodynamics. In fact, when you pay your electric bill every month and you pay for a kilowatt hour, that's actually 1,000 joule hours that you are paying for, which is what Joule is named for. He's really the person that discovered the quantities of energy that we are familiar with. And this is his gravestone in Sale, England. There's a number on top of it. The first thing you might say, well, that's a gravestone marker, that's a particular, plot that he was a part of, but actually this number is very important to us in science and engineering. It is actually his estimate at the time of his death of the heat capacity of water. You can say, well, what is that? Well, he described it as it's the amount of potential energy, that's like lifting a mass up into the air and then dropping it, and the energy we get from that, that's required to raise 1 pound of mass of water by 1 degree Fahrenheit. It's a very important number, but more importantly, the way he discovered this number was that he wrote this article called The Equivalence of Heat. And what he did in his brewery is that he had this churn design with some paddles in it, insulated, and it was a pulley system. We wrapped up the spindle, put 4 pounds of bricks on this little tray, and then dropped it, had it slowly drop, spinning the paddles, dropping to the floor of his brewery, which was a distance of about 35, 36 feet. He ran back up to the top of the brewery, put the 4 pounds of bricks back on, wound the spindle back up, and did it, I think, what does it say here, 16 times in order to detect the small change. Think about that power of observation, that he did this experiment 16 times in a row just to detect a small change in the temperature of the water inside the paddle. And from this observation that he could see the transfer of energy from potential energy of the bricks at the top of his brewery cascading down, that energy goes into the water, raises the temperature of the water. So if he's the first one who actually observes energy not as a fluid, he thought at the time it was the caloric theory of energy, where heat was a fluid, invisible ether that moved through the universe, and that we created it by burning wood or burning coal or burning anything. And so he's the one who really said, wait a minute, there's something else going on. And I want you to watch this description here. Listen to this description of this is his writing in The Equivalence of Heat. This is just a marvelous, I mean, again, the way the naturalists wrote in the 1800s, just listen to it. The phenomena of nature, whether mechanical, chemical, or alive, consist almost entirely in a continual conversion, one into the other. Thus it is, order is maintained in the universe. Nothing is deranged, nothing ever lost, but the entire machinery, as complicated as it is, works smoothly and harmoniously. And everything may appear complicated. I think this is an interesting, everything may appear complicated and involved but in the apparent confusion and intricacy and almost endless variety of causes, effects, conversions, and arrangements, yet it is most perfect regularity is preserved. The whole being governed by the sovereign will of God. This is in a journal article from the 1800s. People were allowed to write like this, not anymore in the scientific journals, of course, but I love this phrasing. And if you remember from the prayer, it's just like this, there is this complicated system that we see. And all of a sudden it distills down to a very clean, understood version. Yeah.
I still have a question about this experiment.
Mhm.
The weights dropped down and there was a paddle.
Yeah, moving.
So the movement of the paddle created that raised the heat of the water. How
Yeah.
cold
So
was
if you put a pot on your stove and you started just turning it without the heat on, it would actually increase the temperature of the water. And the energy is what, like I said, if I were to lift this off of the chair here, I'm putting energy into this thing. And when I drop it, that energy just went down and hit the couch, right? So if I could measure that energy, and then I have to put energy back in, right? I just lifted it. My power strokes here. But yeah, that's the idea. It's supposed to, and by the way, the sign says I shouldn't remove this from the cart. So I also love this in the same article. The naturalist writer, just listen, just imagine communicating in this way in a scientific realm. And for your readers who are so fortunate to reside amid the romantic scenery of Wales or Scotland, could I no doubt confirm my experiments by trying the temperature of the water at the top and the bottom of the waterfall. And if my views be correct, a fall of 817 feet will of course generate 1 degree of heat, and the temperature of the river Niagara will be raised by 1/5 a degree in its fall of 160. And famously,
Fun guy.
Famously, Joule took his thermometers on his honeymoon to this waterfall in the Alps of France and measured, because he was in Sale, England. There were no waterfalls of significant dimension that he had to actually go to on his honeymoon. I wonder who chose that place. And there he again measured the temperature change in this waterfall in the French Alps. So just getting back to our adage, imagine the physicists of the time and around the 1850s, climbing up and say, hey, we just discovered the first law of thermodynamics. And to rephrase it, it's man cannot create or destroy energy. And I wonder about that conversation with the philosophers of the time, saying, I guess we probably could have told you that, that this is God's creation. It's not for you to create and destroy. And I love that paraphrasing of the first. And this is how when you learn that phrase in your thermodynamics class, Jay, you've probably heard that same phrase. Man cannot create or destroy energy. And stepping back from it's very powerful. This is the second story I'd like to tell. This is a picture of my research group at the University of Texas at Austin. And the guy in the middle is the most important one here, obviously. The guy on the left with the scruffy hair that still has not been combed for a number of years is me, a little skinnier. But the guy in the middle is Herman Mark. And the reason I want to tell this story, because as I was thinking about this prayer and the powerful observations of nature, he, in his last years of his life, was living in Austin, Texas, and he would come and lecture us. He's known as the father of polymer chemistry. He was actually, an Austrian, and then obviously right around 1920 was probably the peak of his, scientific, endeavors. He was very well known. He collaborated with Einstein on some of his work, Linus Pauling on some of his work. But what was fascinating about these, I was going to say lectures, because he never lectured. He just sort of sat there and told stories about what life was like to look into the world as a scientist in 1920. And this was marvelous, because if you think about all the tools that we have today, atomic force microscopy, scattering electron microscopy, all the ways to look directly into the world, he had none of that. All he had was his mind, his colleagues, and a few very simple tools. And the tool that he used, like Joule's thermometers, his accurate tool was X-ray diffraction. An X-ray diffraction, if I could explain it, really it's lovely. It's let's shoot an X-ray beam at a substance, and you all know what happens if the beam goes right through. But there's something else that happens on the way through a material. It starts to diffract. It resonates with the order of molecules that are inside of that substance. And so, yes, there's a solid beam that goes right through the material, just like we would expect for X-rays, and the only X-rays that we've seen of ourselves. But then there's these patterns, these waves of the diffracted beam that tell us about the order of the atoms inside of that substance. It's not the beam, it's the other things, it's the waves that permeate out from it. And he was an expert at this. And so he could start looking at the order of atoms inside of substances. And what's important about this is you have to also remember, Niels Bohr discovered that, or really laid out the groundwork for what an atom even was, probably 1911. So we're talking about people were wondering what the heck is even, and I remember Mark talking about, we thought that maybe after some of our observations that these substances were just actually very long atoms. He actually developed what's called the macromolecular theory. In other words, how do atoms strung together in extremely long, thousands and thousands of atoms, all strung together could form these things in nature like fibers and natural rubber, all from the trees of the rubber plant, of the rubber tree plant. And so he was actually the one, and I guess I was just struck by this infancy or this inability to see, but still stretch out one's imagination to understand. And I think that another parallel to our faith, we don't see these things, but we use all of the tools that we have. We use our practice, we use our liturgy to try and understand. One of the more fascinating stories about him, as he escaped Austria in 1938, he had begun buying platinum wire. and forming it into coat hangers, so that as he went across the border to escape, all of his wealth was actually hung up in his in his wardrobe, so that, and then he could cash the material. So gold wouldn't have passed, dollars, or obviously the marks wouldn't have passed, but he was able to get through the border with his wealth by hiding his wealth in platinum wires designed as hangers. And so this observation of the natural world again struck me, and again those limits of science at the time, and just to give you some sense. And as these scientists at this time, the 20s and 30s, looked into the world, they saw that the natural world had such wonders, such keys to how we could string things together synthetically for man. In fact, here's a great example. This is the chemical structure, the majority of the chemical structure of spider silk. The chemical structure below is how we make synthetic fibers out of nylon. It's remarkable. It's not a coincidence that these things are similar, because of the chemical nature that the map that nature provided us to show how to make extremely strong fibers. This is exactly what nylon is. It's a replication of the fibers that exist all around us, whether it's spider silk or silkworms, all the same kinds of materials. So that was story 2. Let me go to story 3. And it's a whale story. This is an interesting story about observing nature. Many of you may have heard of it, but this is a sperm whale and I think actually this picture was taken in Alaska. But this is obviously the carcass or a body of a sperm whale. And if you notice that its mouth, you can see the mouth of the sperm whale. It's very sort of narrow, and it's that plank that sticks out. And then above the mouth is this enormous nose. It's called the junk of a sperm whale. A whale this size would produce several hundred gallons of sperm whale oil, or oil from that could be used. And I guess you probably know it was all used for lighting our homes in the early 1800s. So I'm going to run through sort of 3 technologies that help solve this problem. And we talked last week about the form of extractive sort of work that humans find themselves in. And I think what we'll see here is just that. Now, this is a very complicated chart, but I want you to focus on the blue and the red. Can everyone see that? So the blue line is the amount of sperm whales that were harvested in the United States in the early 1800s here. The chart goes from 1820 to roughly 1890. And as you can see, the sperm whale oil production is going up and up, or the number of sperm whales going up and up and up, and all of a sudden it starts going down. In the meantime, all of the other whales, and that oil from the other whales, nowhere near as good as sperm whale oil. Sperm whale oil was the best, at brightest burning, all of the above. But as you notice that as the sperm whale oil starts to decline, we still see another increase in the other whales. In other words, what happened here was the number of sperm whales was starting to decrease. We couldn't find them anymore. And in fact, if you read Moby Dick, which was, I think, released in 1850-ish, they were going to the south tip of Africa to find sperm whales to bring back to Nantucket. I mean, really, you think about the extent that they're going and traveling across the world for 500 gallons of sperm whale oil. Really a remarkable, but this is how we lit our homes. Now, I'm going to turn my phone off here. But then you can see that the other whale oil starts to decline as well. And in this case, it wasn't necessarily that they're running out of whales. It's that there's other technologies that started to evolve. And this is, by the way, this story was first told in Amory Lovin's, or that I remember reading, Amory Lovin's Winning the Oil Endgame. Because he's talking about we've come to this point where we've depleted a resource, and then a technology comes in to basically substitute. And so this guy, Gessner, patents in 1854, actually did the experiments right around 1850. But he noticed that there's like a a grease inside of coal. And he actually distilled coal and extracted out the extract from it. And say we know that as kerosene. It's the liquid that's embedded inside of coal. And basically he found kerosene. And of course, it's a very difficult way to produce kerosene. So it's not perfect, but this was a very important invention. And then just to give you some sense, obviously in 1850, we didn't know what chemical structures were, but it had all the properties of whale oil. It had the distinctive ability to burn and brightly, just like sperm whale oil. And it's no coincidence. Here we see that here's on the bottom is the chemical structure of sperm whale oil, and on the top is the chemical structure of kerosene, roughly. You know, it's always a mix in the case of oil and sperm whales as well. And here we did. We grew dependent. We already were dependent on breaking the carbon-carbon bond in sperm whale oil. And now we're becoming dependent on breaking the carbon-carbon bond in kerosene. Because as Jay would tell you, you break this carbon bond, there's a tremendous amount of energy that's released. And we use that energy for almost everything that we do. And more importantly, because this kerosene was a liquid, it could be transported, and then you could light something in another place. It was a high concentration of energy inside of this fluid. But of course, in order for it to be used heavily, they had to redesign the lanterns. Dietz, famously, there's Dietz, and I think the company still exists. Actually, they're manufactured in China, Dietz kerosene lanterns. But smokeless, so they had to redesign the head of the lamp burner. And then perhaps more importantly, in this story is this guy, Sam Kyer. He was a salt manufacturer in Western Pennsylvania that had a problem. Now, at this time, salt manufacturing, they would drive a well down into the surface and then inject water and have the salt be dissolved and then come back up, and then they would dry it and then they would sell the salt that way. Well, his wells in Western Pennsylvania had this problem with it, because when he injected the water to have the water with the salt dissolved in it come back up to the surface, it was coming up with this oily substance, which he didn't know what to do with. In fact, it's somewhat remarkable because he actually, when life gives you lemons, he makes lemonade. In fact, he makes snake oil out of it. So the first use of petroleum was as an ointment. As you can see here, it helps with chest and windpipe and lungs, diarrhea, cholera, piles. I don't even know what that is. But he was selling this snake oil, and he starts asking around, what else can I do with this? And a part of that conversation was a chemist at Pennsylvania University who told him about Gessner's patent. And actually, what he did then was said, well, wait a minute, if I distill this oil, perhaps there's this kerosene substance in it. And sure enough, here's a crude picture of his still on the right here. He distills this petroleum product and finds in it kerosene. And then the race is on. Because, of course, this famous man, Edwin Drake, goes out to Western Pennsylvania, drills a deeper well, 70 feet. To give you some sense, the average oil well today is about 7,000 feet deep here in the United States. And we drill up to 30,000 feet for oil today. But Edwin finds oil 70 feet below the surface. Immediately, kerosene price is a quarter of that of whale oil. And if you look at the yellow graph here on this chart, that is the size of the whaling fleet. And it starts to collapse and erode and collapse and diminishes. Now, just to give you some sense, at the peak of this chart, in 1850 to 1860, we were harvesting for the United States, harvesting about 10,000 whales per year. Today in the world, we still haven't recovered the whale population. And so I say, that this is a story of perhaps saving the whales, but I think it's more of a story of us giving time to save the whales. We still harvest about 1,500 to 2,000 whales a year in the world. But still a very heavy load in terms of their ability to. But this is actually a cartoon I think the predecessor to Boston Globe. This is a cartoon of a whale party after discovery of oil in Pennsylvania. And I love the saying on the right there, it says, "Oil's well that ends well." So it's a party of the whales that celebrating the discovery of oil in Pennsylvania. So I wonder if this is really resurrection, because again, I think what this technology, which is always driven by economics, but also the hardships of harvesting these whales, as we read in Moby Dick, this is not a pleasant business, but now we can harvest it from the ground. But we've grown addicted to breaking carbon-carbon bonds. We've grown addicted to the energy that's given from the breaking of this bond. We burn basically a swimming pool of oil per second on the planet. There's some rays of hope. The question then is, looking back at nature, how does nature do it the opposite way? And this is a protein, this folded protein. Imagine, look at our understanding of molecular structure now. But this is a folded protein, and it's the Rubisco enzyme that's inside of all plants. And this is the secret sauce. This is what for 1 billion years has been grabbing carbon dioxide out of the air and then combining it together to make the sugar, which is a carbon-carbon bond. This is an extremely difficult chemical reaction to do synthetically. Man does not know how to do it energy efficiently, but plants have for years and billions of years. In fact, it's considered to be the most abundant protein on the planet. It's existed for billions of years in algae, and it's really what gave us oil to begin with, that this harvesting of CO2 and connecting carbon-carbon bonds. So really, again, I think what you're finding scientists and engineers are doing is, yes, they're looking at nature. How can we overcome this really activation barrier to recombine carbon dioxide into a carbon-carbon bond so we can burn it again, of course. But then there's other things like, well, why can't we just make seashells? Take the carbon dioxide out of the air and lock it into a stone, lock it into a shell, which is another way of harvesting. So there's many ways in which scientists and engineers are looking at this problem of reversing this chemical reaction. And hopefully, this is just one piece of, there's no silver bullet for our issues with carbon dioxide and the planet, because we've got a lot of work to do. But again, scientists and engineers are looking to nature. And so with that, I would just like to close. This is a picture that, and open it up for discussion. This is a picture of, actually, I always stump our students, it's a picture of the planet Earth. In fact, it's the second picture from distant outer space of planet Earth. And let me just show you if you guys can see this little dot here. I'll blow it up. That's Earth. It's a pretty remarkable picture. You talk about humility. This is the picture that I show our engineering students to remind them that they are dust. And I think about the prayer that we started with, and truly humbly seeking an understanding of infinite creation. And so, yeah, I think you can't help but be humbled by this picture. And I also think when I see this picture, I also think about Christ's last prayer for us, that they all may be one. Maybe it's that they all see themselves as one, because we're a dot, we're a few pixels on a screen, if you will, and we have a lot of work to do to look at God's creation and harvest information and unravel these, understand the mysteries of God's creation. For that, I'd like to open it up and thanks, Barbara. Yeah, Phil.
Technical question. So this is a picture of a
The Cassini Space Explorer looking at it was sent to explore Saturn,
right.
but in the background there's a photobomb of the Earth, planet Earth.
Got it.
Yeah, Barbara.
Yeah, and one statement from the astronauts or whatever that beheld Earth from far away. They thought everything I love is on that little dot.
Yeah.
Music and history and religion and all of that is on that tiny dot spinning in space, which is humbling to amazing. And I also wanted to say that it's so fun to listen to somebody who is really excited and has energy for their field. It's just so fun to hear that instead of less
Less fun.
energetic.
You know, Barbara, actually, when I see this picture here too, I'm often reminded of when you guided us through the movie Contact and Jodie Foster's quote when she's hurtling through space or the time warp or whatever. They should have sent a poet.
Yeah.
I love that quote. They should have sent the poet.
I have a question.
Yeah.
This, this is like totally not my world, so this might sound like a dumb question, but when you said at the beginning about we can't change energy, that law of thermodynamics, how does it work, like what we're doing with pollution or with things that we've done to energy that are destroying the clean water or the polar bears or all those different things, the effects of, what's the difference
Right.
between,
Well,
we
there's,
can't change it, but, oh yeah, we are changing.
yeah, well, there's also, let me just say, there's usable energy. Like I said, the carbon-carbon bond that I was talking about is very usable because you break it and this energy just, think about your car engine, there's 3,000 RPM. I mean, there's thousands of explosions of carbon-carbon bonds being burnt per minute, right, per second. It's really that usable energy. And then how do we put it back so we can use it again? It's kind of like, you know, there are losses. In fact, if the energy we put into your car, the gasoline, only about 25% of that energy moves your car. 75% goes into noise, it goes into heat, mostly heat. It just goes off into the atmosphere and there's no way to collect it back, right? And so maybe it's kind of like a ball at the top of a hill where once you let it go, you know, it's going to be there and it's all the frictional losses and all the things that we say don't count when you're studying physics 101, but now do. All of that stuff is captured in there. And chemical energy is one of those ones that really is tricky because reversing that require, you know, so much of that ball going down the hill, it's really hard to roll it back up the hill. And so that's, and still retain, and that's what I was explaining really with carbon dioxide is that, you know, you take kerosene and you burn it, or you take gasoline and they're almost identical. You wouldn't be able to tell the difference in chemical structure. You burn it, the ball rolls down the hill. Now we got all these products here and heat that we can't go grab and put back into the box. You know, the genie's out of the bottle at that point. But how do we roll it back up the hill without having an energy penalty? We would call an energy penalty, because if it takes us more energy to put it back up the hill than it does that we got it out, then that's an energy penalty. And so it's really the forms that energy takes and can we use them for other things?
Or a health penalty. I was thinking about those poor people that bought the snake oil.
Well, there's that. I mean, there's a cost to that too, because, you know, look, NOx and SOx and all the chemicals that are being released in our process of producing other material. It is one other comment about the oil gets such a bad name with plastics. We harvest from the ground. The United States consumes about 15 million barrels of oil a day. 88% of that is burnt. 12% is converted almost to everything you use in your life. The bristles on your toothbrush, the aspirin you might have taken this morning, the fibers on that couch, the fibers on your jacket, the paint on the walls, the carpeting is plastic. You know, it is all consumed. All of our life really is that 12%. And obviously plastic packaging is, you know, an extreme nuisance in our lives and in the oceans. But also the fibers in our shirts, by the way, we're finding them in the ocean at scales that we never even imagined. Yeah, Jay, you were
Oh, just in response to what Susan was saying, that Linda Berry talks about in agriculture, there can be a certain kind of cycle where you return the energy back to the ground.
Mm-hmm.
And in his case, farming with horses,
Mm-hmm.
that the energy of the horse as opposed to the energy of using gasoline or fuel oil or something to run a tractor. All that to say that there are certain cycles in which you recover the energy and use it again in an appropriate way.
Mm.
Even the energy of producing the grain that the horse will eat, that then the horse produces manure that then is spread back on the field again. So there's a cycle of return.
Mhm.
And I hear you saying that our problem is with certain forms of energy, we haven't figured out how to do the cycle of return.
Right. I think that'd be a fair.
It gets lost, and it's not that it's gone.
Mhm.
It's just not functional again in a way that we can return it
Mhm.
back in a productive and energy producing way, as you can in certain forms of traditional agriculture. And
Yeah.
even using chemical fertilizer is another way in which, again, there's a kind of return there, but the loss is still.
Well, and then when it gets escapes
Yes.
off of
Yeah.
and into the river, it grows
Exactly.
great things in the river too. If you ever look at the algae bloom outside of the city of New Orleans, it's extraordinary, all from Midwest farming.
Sort of, as I'm listening, I was thinking, just in case this return implies some kind of perpetual motion machine,
Mhm.
we need to remember the energy that the sun is adding to make all these things happen.
Yeah,
So it's a supplier, a net supplier of energy of that we're losing in
Right.
other ways in our conversion process.
and there, in that number alone, Roger, is hope. Because the amount of energy that the sun is cascading on us through irradiance is enough. I mean, significantly more than enough. It is, it's what, by the way, it's what causes wind, what causes, we harvest it with solar panels. It, obviously it captures in the growth of plants and things, and algae, by the way.
Can you say more, enough for what? It's more than
If
enough.
you were to, a really good thing in engineering to do what's called a control volume analysis, you could say, all right, here's a box, let's put it around the planet Earth. We could say, these guys need this much energy to survive with 8 billion or 10 billion people. If we look at the inputs from the sun, there's enough energy to supply those people. Now, it's a matter of harvesting it in a way that's efficient. So there's, and I'm not talking about, oh, it's about 99%. It's been a while since I looked at that number, but it's, 1,000 times more than we need. So it's
Wow.
really a matter of, there's some hope in what Roger was just saying, is that the continual supply of energy from this mass of, burning many substances burning and irradiating onto the earth is enough energy for us to live on.
Oh, great.
Yeah, Mark.
Don, I really appreciated one of the kind of big picture points that you made near the beginning of your presentation is that theological truth, philosophical truth, and scientific truth are not actually opposed to one another.
No,
Right? And
yeah.
this is such a frequent misperception on the part of those who approach the interactions between theology and science. If you look at the history of the fields, of both fields,
Right.
you find theologians who are deeply, deeply interested in the natural world, and you find scientists who are deeply religious individuals in many cases, who
Oh, yeah.
are
Jewel was,
inspired. Jewel being one
Yeah.
instance of that, right?
yeah. And that he was, effectively seeking God.
Right. Yeah.
So I think you're right. And what happens is that we, there's a dual-edged sword to science. We say that this is the truth, right? And then 100 years later, we find there's a different truth. And so our absolutism is what and think about the whole, climate change debate. Well, 99% of the scientists, say that this is what's happening. Well, 1%, and so there's these, well, that's not true. I think if you balance how much of our percentage of complete understanding comes from philosophy or theology, you would understand, well, that feels all right with 99%. But somehow science has got to be 100%. And I think it's really, well, just think about Joule. Well, no, the caloric theory of heat was that was given. Aristotelian physics, for hundreds of years was what governed us. But then Newton comes along and just, well, that's over. So I think that the scientists need to be careful with their absolutism, in terms of how they're stating things. That it is that we are, it's a body of knowledge, and that knowledge is imperfect, just like we are. And so we need to be careful with how much we overstate the power of science, because it's limited too.
But the other aspect of that is that being imperfect doesn't mean it's all up for grabs. Who could possibly say?
Yeah.
It's like relativism,
Yeah,
one
right,
person's
yeah.
If it is 99%
Right.
saying one thing, there's very, very good reason to support that viewpoint.
Right.
It's not absolutely, as you're saying, it's not absolute, it's not eternal,
Right.
but it is a very, very solid
Yeah.
sense of what's happening.
And this is what is guiding us. And we keep finding that, yeah, this works here, and this works here, it works here. Another thing that I find interesting about the evolution of science too, is that when things don't work, when things start to fall apart, instead of saying, do we need to rethink this? We just kind of add on things. Aristotelian physics is a classic of that. But, well, it doesn't work in the case of the large rock, but it works in the case of the small rock. So we have to have a large rock, factor, fudge factor. and I think the parallel, if you think about the Old Testament and the New Testament, of the building of the laws and the complexity of our relationship with God. Right? We kind of kept on adding things. And then Christ comes and says, no, really, it's just one thing, right? It's just love your neighbor as yourself, and everything else kind of falls down from the, oh, someone came in and took this incredible complex relationship of, burnt offerings or whatever you have, and ways to do things you can do. You can't help the Samaritan on the side of the road because you can't touch him on Sundays or whatever it was. We created this incredibly complex system of patterns of human behavior to have a relationship with God. And then Christ comes and says, it's just this. And so I think that there's some real patterns there with science as its evolution. That another great example of that is the multi-flood theory. So what happened was these miners are going down in these coal mines in England, and I think also the Netherlands, I can't remember exactly, but they discover a layer of bones in the sediment, and all the Christian fundamentals. See, we told you, the flood. Those are the animals that didn't make it onto Noah's Ark. Duh. We go down, another 1,000 feet or so, and there's another layer of bones. And so instead of saying, well, maybe we should rethink this idea, they started coming up with the multi-flood theory, that there was not just one flood, there were a couple. There were three. So we continually try to overly complicate what we see in front of us. And the reality is that there's probably a simpler Occam's razor sort of explanation to the marvel. And I love Jules' expression. The first law is as complicated as it seems. It's actually just really this fluid motion of one form transforming into another, and eventually, there's no complexity here. It's just, this is how the world works. And so
Another example of that is Aristotelian astronomy, where they were adding more and more of these eccentric circles to explain the fact.
right, the positioning of the stars. How could they be like this if it's all just a dome with supported on turtle's back? We got to have, oh no, there are two domes. It's exactly two multicentric domes that are explaining the positioning of the stars moving in relationship to one another. But again, another powerful observation of the natural world that shows us something about ourselves.
Don,
Yes, Craig.
I just want to say thank you so much for sharing all of your wisdom and connecting it with your faith life, the theology that's just infectious. I love the energy. Thank you so much for teaching us and seeing the world in this new way. I wanted to get my thanks in before everyone needs to go to worship.
Craig, would you like to close us in prayer then, since you're on? This is our time.
Gladly. Yeah, I would be happy to do that. I have a collect here in the Book of Common Prayer on page 827, and it's for knowledge of God's creation, which I think you offered. So let me offer the other one, which is for the conservation of natural resources. The Lord be with you.
Also with
Also with
you.
you.
Let us pray. Almighty God, in entrusting us to be the good stewards of your creation on earth, you made us fellow workers in your creation. Give us wisdom and reverence so to use the resources of nature, that no one may suffer from our abuse of them, and that generations yet to come may continue to praise you for your bounty. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Thanks, Greg. Thank you all.
Thank you, Don.
Thank you, Don, for an excellent presentation. Everyone, please come back for our final installment of the Biomimicry and Resurrection series with Sarah Stengel, who will be teaching us about the intersections of art, mathematics, and theology around resurrection. So please join us for that next Sunday at 9 o'clock.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Don.
Yeah, thanks, Donna.